welcome so many of you from around the world this afternoon. My name is David Weston. I am the Managing Director at the Institute. We are a London-based global think tank. Our vision is to build a movement of people worldwide, committed to creating the pathways from poverty to prosperity. In the last 12 months alone, we've worked across countries such as Ghana, Colombia, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, the US, and the UK. The Courage in Journalism Award is a very special event in our calendar. Its roots are based in our vision to see the transformation of society and champion freedom across the world. The award is also deeply personal to us at the Institute. We established the award following the tragic death of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the respected Maltese journalist who was murdered by a car bomb in October 2017. Daphne's son Paul worked with us here at the Institute, and this award was created to honour her legacy and to shine a spotlight on the dangers facing journalists globally. I'm delighted to welcome Paul, who joins us today and will reflect later on the hard-fought change and impact that has occurred in Malta as a result of Daphne's death. Journalists across the world are increasingly under threat of arrest and attack as they continue in their pursuit of freedom and truth. The Legatum Institute's work shows that whilst in the last decade global prosperity has risen, in the same period personal freedoms and governance have declined worldwide. Over half of the 167 countries in our Global Prosperity Index have seen a weakening in governance in the last 10 years. And similarly, about half have experienced reducing personal freedoms, including freedom of assembly and association, and freedom of speech and access to information. Media freedom is fundamental to maintaining a strong social contract between peoples and governments. But across the world, safety of journalists, freedom from government censorship, and freedom of expression are all at lower levels than 10 years ago. It is this determination and courage of journalists like Daphne that the award seeks to recognise. The award honours journalists who have been tragically killed in the last 12 months. For obvious reasons, there's no winner. This is not a celebration award. It's an urgent call for action. By coming together today, raising awareness of these issues and highlighting one recipient, we honour all journalists around the world operating in hostile environments, sometimes paying the ultimate price. And we stand together with them, dedicating ourselves to press freedom globally. It's been a pleasure to work this year with our wise and experienced panel of judges, some of whom we will hear from later as we seek to understand both what it's like working on the ground in some of the most dangerous places in the world, and as we discuss how we can better protect journalists. They are Abeer Saady, Christina Lamb, Con Coughlin, David Freud, and Mike Thompson. And on behalf of the Legatum Institute and all our guests today, I would like to thank the judges for their passion and commitment to this award and to our shared mission. The Courage in Journalism Award aims to punch holes in the darkness that undermines truth and shine a light on the countries where press freedoms are still constrained either by crime, corruption, war, or state-led censorship. Let's remind ourselves of why these issues are so urgent in our world today.
Around the world, media freedoms are increasingly under threat. According to the 2020 Legatum Prosperity Index, freedom of speech and access to information has declined in almost 3/4 of countries in the world over the past decade. Across the globe, journalist safety, freedom from government censorship, political diversity of media perspectives, and freedom of opinion and expression were all at lower levels in 2020 than they were in 2007. In recent years, we have also seen journalists being personally targeted as a result of their investigative work, including the tragic murders of high-profile reporters such as Jamal Khashoggi, Mary Colvin, and Daphne Caruana Galizia. According to Reporters Without Borders, over 900 journalists have been killed in the past decade. The Middle East remains the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist due to conflict, particularly Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. However, 2/3 of the journalists who have lost their lives since 2010 have died in countries that are not at war. Journalists continue to face threats to their lives in the Philippines, India, Honduras, Colombia, Brazil, Egypt, and numerous other countries that are at peace. At the top of the list is Mexico, the most dangerous place for journalists in the world. Those investigating the nexus between organized crime and corruption are most frequently targeted, in a country which seemingly suffers a culture of impunity. Sadly, in many countries today, there is still significant state-sponsored censorship of the press. Some countries have notably taken advantage of the COVID-19 crisis by repressing independent media outlets and passing laws to make it easier to incarcerate journalists. Around the world, the press continues to suffer from increasing aggression by authoritarian regimes, a decrease in democratic guarantees, and a rise in polarization and repressive policies. More than ever, we need renewed international focus on protecting and improving media freedoms. The work of the Legatum Institute shows that a free and independent media is fundamental to prosperity. It empowers people by ensuring they are informed and able to debate critical issues. It emboldens individuals to speak truth to power and to hold leaders to account. And it provides essential scrutiny and accountability of decision-making at all levels and in all sectors. We owe the men and women who risk and have given their lives for these fundamental values a great debt. We condemn these restrictions on press freedoms and impunity from the rule of law, and we stand in solidarity with journalists all over the world in the pursuit of freedom and truth.
I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by two of our judging panel for their insight into the challenges facing journalists today. Mike Thompson is the World Affairs Correspondent for the BBC and is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His career has seen him cover conflict across the globe, from Colombia to Sri Lanka, uncovering some of the world's most harrowing stories. We're also delighted to be joined by Abeer Saady. Abeer is a war correspondent, researcher, and journalist safety trainer with experience on the ground in conflict areas from Syria to Sudan, the Philippines to Pakistan. Abeer, Mike, it's great to have you with us today. Mike, can I first turn to you for a global perspective? Freedom of expression is enshrined in Article 19 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, ratified by all 193 member countries of the UN. Why is it then, do you think, that more journalists are now being targeted and murdered in countries supposedly at peace?
Well, interesting question, David. And I think one of the big reasons is a bit like the way war itself has gone. It used to be fought on far-flung battlefields away from civilians. And as we know, over the last century, that's increasingly changed and war has come home to civilians. And so often, they're the biggest casualties. And the same for journalists, really. I mean, it's totally changed the way dangers work. It's not just when you're on the front line, which obviously is always dangerous, but it's also when you're in countries at peace where you're pursuing a particular story And governments have so many ways to check what you're doing and try and stop what you're doing. The growth in technology, for instance, means your phone can be traced wherever you are. You can be bugged, and people can snoop on you in so many different forms. And this makes it increasingly dangerous. They can also shut off what journalists are doing when it's reported on the internet, and it means journalists constantly are locked in this battle with officialdom. And you can see as well the way journalists have been discredited by not just governments in the Middle East or North Africa or places where we see a lot of problems for journalists, but even in the USA with former President Donald Trump, how he put journalists up as purveyors of fake news and damaged their reputation and incited in many ways violence against people, or at least that was how many journalists felt. But it's not just governments, it's also the big drug cartels, big crime syndicates, which are beyond the control of governments. And if you hit these people in the pocket, that's where it really hurts. Never mind individuals' reputation, but when their profits get hit, when journalists are researching them, that's the time you've really got to watch out. And as you've highlighted with Mexico, it's a massive problem there. But it's a problem across the world, whether it's peace or in war.
Thank you, Mike. Abeer, the Middle East and North Africa remains the most dangerous place in the world for journalists. In your view, what's holding this region back, particularly from improving press freedoms?
Let's always remember the freedom of expression is not only for journalists, it's a situation as a part of human rights. And we're speaking about a bad situation for human rights, not only in the Middle East, but it was impacted as well by leaders during this time, like as Mike had mentioned, during in America, the former president, Donald Trump, were calling journalists fake news. So there was a very big issue for this. The Middle East and this region has always have those, especially for the last decade after the fail of the Arab Spring, they are still having the bad consequences about that. There would be no demonstration, no expression. There would be a very big censorship. But most, and I think this is the chilling effect, is imprisonment of journalists. In the Middle East, there are countries like Egypt and like Turkey who has the biggest numbers of journalists who are imprisoned. Apart from this, there is others who lost their lives. We have Nizar Hussein in Iraq. We have Nabil Hassan in Yemen, which is very less reported, the more less reported country in the world that have conflicts. So those are numbers of conflicts that are there. What I agree with Mike is that from the international reporters who can travel, which now, travel, there is a big ban for this, but the local journalists are targeted. Most of the journalists that we have in the list are targeted inside their houses, in front of their houses, or in front of their works. So the local journalists internationally, and especially in the Middle East, they need a lot of protection from government censorship and oppression, and as well, as Mike has said, from those who are really hurt in their pocket, like drug dealers and money laundering, and those investigative journalists are dealing with.
I want to pick up with you, Abeer, on women journalists for a second as well, if you don't mind. Last year saw a 35% increase in the number of female journalists arbitrarily detained. Why is it that we're seeing more women targeted, do you think?
Yeah, it's more and more. I've been in the award for the third year, and I see the numbers of women that are targeted is big. We're speaking 2 years ago about Marie Colvin, who was a war correspondent, someone who goes to the war, which is very bad. But later on, we speak about Daphne, who was really in her country, but doing investigative reporting, and Gary Longshore in India, and this year Maria Hernandez in Mexico, which is very, very brave journalist who really insisted to do that. And I think more and more women are doing work. And now we are not speaking only on the international one who choose to go to the war zones, but on the local level. The problem with women in particular, and this is what I always target, in my trainings and everything is that she faces the general threats that her male colleague face, and she faces as well an additional threats for gender-based attacks. And it's not only in this case the gender-based attacks that cause deaths, but we have a lot of stuff. We have a lot of women who are in prison, and we have a lot of women who face those kind of gender-based attacks inside work, even from colleagues and outside. So there is a lot of threats. Luckily, we have more women getting into this field. But the lack of impunity, this is a bad issue for men and women. And we hope this year, one of the messages is really to follow up. I'm glad that in the case of Daphne, there is a follow-up in her case, but I would like to see this in other issues too.
Yeah, and we would too. Thank you. Mike, Abeer, maybe a question for both of you. Mike, if you would go first. We know that government censorship is increasing in many countries around the world. And we also know of journalists arrested for their coverage of COVID-19. What are the challenges that the pandemic itself has posed to media freedom?
Well, one of the biggest things that dictators in particular fear, authoritarian governments, is when their opponents get together. Now, that's something that under COVID situations you can stop legitimately in some cases. There's lockdowns, and obviously you don't want people getting together and spreading the virus. But for those who want to abuse this, it's a golden opportunity. If you take even the elections in Uganda, for instance, there was a lot of talk there about this being used to stop opposition rallies happening, people getting together to draw support, to encourage support. And we've seen right across the world, as in fact the film mentioned, in many countries, this being used, I mean, from Russia to the Philippines, and in places like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, huge fines being levied for people who criticize the government's COVID policy, because the government will call it fake news, going back to the phrase so used by Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump. And in Hungary, we've seen Viktor Orban's government bring in an emergency decree which covers coverage of just about anything from health to transport systems, and stopping journalists doing their job. And of course, it's not just that. While the West, all our countries, are preoccupied with our own terrible COVID pandemic, they're banking on the fact that we're often not looking at what they're doing, the journalists and others, in their own country, because the world, much of the world, has its eye off the ball. It's worrying about its own problems.
Yeah, very insightful. Abeer, your thoughts on government censorship through the pandemic?
Yeah, not only governments. And I mean, like, if we speak about a very, very important death that happened this year of Malali and Luit, one of the Afghani journalists who died this year, and 4 of her colleagues, I think even like the terrorist groups that are in some countries and the who are governments. And they use actually that the Western world now is more into protecting their people. There is no really prioritization, and I mean it, of human rights issues during 2020. There was a very big lockdown, so it opens the way. So I would like to speak about Malali, and we speak about other countries where the journalist died. There is another kind of death here this year, and for example, a country like Egypt, we're speaking about around 15 of the journalists who lost their lives. And when I speak about hundreds, for God's sake, journalists are on the front line as well, who are covering this global pandemic. And in addition to this, the journalists who went to prison during this year. So it's a very bad situation. And government and other groups have used it back. And it was a very chilling effect for the journalists' lives and the freedom of expression in general.
Yeah. Hey, listen, thank you so much for your insights, and thank you for the work that you are doing and your colleagues are doing around the world in the pursuit of truth. We support you and we stand with you. So thank you, both Mike and Abeer. In the last year, 44 journalists have been murdered around the world. Let's take a moment to honour these courageous men and women. Each of these 44 journalists has demonstrated extraordinary and continuous courage in the face of huge personal threat. We stand with these brave men and women to honour them, and our thoughts are with their families and loved ones. One journalist's story stood out to our judges this year for her determination and her refusal to be intimidated despite continued threats to her life. Her name is Maria Elena Ferral. Maria Elena was a Mexican journalist working for over 30 years as a local news correspondent. She was also the founder of a local news website, El Quinto Poder, in the Veracruz region of Mexico, an area where local criminal cartels use the state's highway for trafficking illegal goods and drugs. On the 12th of March last year, despite pleas to heed caution from her family, Maria Elena published an article in which she detailed significant corruption in local elections and shone a spotlight on the murders of 4 candidates for mayor. Just over 2 weeks later, Maria was shot dead by 2 gunmen. This was not the first time that Maria Elena had been targeted. As well as receiving several death threats, she had also survived 3 attempts on her life as a direct result of her work as a journalist. Following her death, an investigation was opened, arrests were made, but justice is yet to be served. Maria Elena was 49 years old and leaves behind 2 grown-up children. Despite the risks, Maria Elena's daughter, Maria Fernanda, continues in her mother's footsteps, working as a journalist. Like her mother, Maria Fernanda was also personally targeted by gunmen earlier this year, but survived. The judges were astonished by the outstanding courage and determination to continue their work that both Maria Elena and her daughter have shown, knowing only too well the personal risk to their safety. Maria Elena Ferral has been awarded the 2021 Courage in Journalism Award, and we were honoured to meet Maria Fernanda when she accepted this award on behalf of her mother earlier this month.
Pues agradecerles al Legatum Institute por este gran premio y créanme que María Elena se habría sentido inmensamente orgullosa de recibirlo, que alguien le reconozca su labor periodística y sobre todo su coraje periodístico. Bueno, pues ella ha dejado un gran legado y un gran vacío a nivel periodístico en la zona. Varios comentarios se han escuchado de que no hay ninguna otra periodista como ella. Para empezar, fue la primera mujer periodista en la zona, así que pues eso fue todo un reto para ella, porque eran puros periodistas hombres y no había cabida para una mujer en el periodismo. Ella se fue haciendo su propio camino. Posterior a eso empezaron las amenazas por sus trabajos de investigación, porque ella era la que decía lo que la mayoría no se atrevía a escribir o a poner en sus notas. Ella tuvo en total 3 atentados y el 4º fue el que terminó con su vida. Sus principios eran siempre decir la verdad, siempre, no importaba qué. Así, ella sabía que corría peligro por decir la verdad, ella lo hacía. Pero lo hacía porque esa era su pasión, su amor, el periodismo. La última amenaza que ella hizo pública fue la del entonces candidato por la diputación local, Basilio Camerino Picasso Pérez. En la columna ella mencionó al grupo Totonacapan. Este grupo era formado por políticos, caciques de la zona norte del estado de Veracruz, y ella en esta columna expone cómo querían controlar todo el distrito. Expuso casos de asesinatos de este grupo político que no han sido resueltos. Yo recibí el atentado el 24 de mayo del 2020 por el hecho de haber escrito la segunda parte de la columna que ella había dejado. En esta segunda parte yo toco el tema María Elena Ferral como eje central de mi columna, el por qué sigue y seguiría en la impunidad, lo cual no me equivoqué porque efectivamente sigue en la impunidad este caso. Bueno, yo espero que el legado de María Elena Ferral continúe en la zona norte del estado de Veracruz, en Veracruz y en el país. Quiero continuar su legado con su ejemplo. Ella me enseñó a no tenerles miedo y a decir la verdad, a ayudar a la gente diciendo la verdad.
A huge thank you to Maria Fernanda for accepting this award on behalf of her mother. And our hearts are with her as she seeks justice for Maria Elena and continues courageously with her own work. Mexico is the most dangerous country to be a journalist in the world, and it has been this way for several years now. A staggering 78 journalists have been killed in Mexico since 2010. However, there are pioneering organizations in Mexico who continue to dedicate themselves to championing the safety and security of journalists and the freedom of the press. One of our judging panel, Lord David Freud, caught up with Pedro Cardenas from Article 19 about their work in Mexico.
Hello, my name is David Freud and I'm a former journalist, a member of the House of Lords and one of the judges for the 2021 Courage in Journalism Award. For many years, Mexico has been one of the most dangerous country in the world, outside a war zone, to be a journalist. And in the last year, the number of attacks on journalists has accelerated still further. Journalists who cover sensitive political stories on organised crime are frequently targeted, warned, threatened, abducted, disappeared, and often killed in cold blood. Here with us today to explore these questions is Pedro Cardenas. Pedro is the coordinator of Article 19's Protection and Defense Program in Mexico and Central America. Pedro, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
I'd like to start just talking about this is Mexico's most unusual. It's not. It's a democratic country. It's not at war. I mean, those are the two, the autocracies and the war torn countries are where you see high risk to journalists. Mexico's not in that category, and yet there are more killed in Mexico than anywhere else. And how do you account for that?
We believe we can account for this in three different states. The first one is historically. Mexico, while it is currently a democracy, for a long time was an autocracy controlled by a ruling party that in many of times set up a tradition of silencing those that it opposed. In many ways, activists, journalists would simply disappear in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this tradition sort of continued and has been followed in many different scenarios. However, we can see a turning point in Mexico since the year 2006 when President Calderón at the time started the war on drugs. This generated a militarization of the country that has continued on for the last two administrations and the current administration as well. The use of the military, the use of armed forces as a way to combat has only resulted in much more pain and damage, in the sense that there has been a series of attacks from both sides. The press ends up being between a rock and a hard place. The cartels on one side attacking and threatening, and on the other hand, the government that considers them as opposition. And then, I mean, the context, of course, is, as we've just discussed, is a very sharp acceleration in 2020 of attacks on journalists. Is there any particular reason for that acceleration, or is it just building up and building up? We can consider it a build-up. Like we stated, since 2006, we've started noticing this trend. And particularly since 2009 up to 2020, we can consider that there's an average of 12% increase in attacks against the press. Today in 2020, like we said yesterday in our annual report, we documented 692 attacks and aggressions against the press throughout the year. The majority of them are directly being caused by public officials, whether it be armed forces, security, civil forces, or public statesmen as well. So, I mean, this talk about it being because of organized crime is actually moving away from the point at the moment. It's more the officials that are leading this process. Absolutely. One thing that is interesting is that while organized crime is seen as the scapegoat, this is always organized crime's fault, in reality, we are noticing that a lot of information blockades, a lot of stigmatization campaigns, a lot of attacks directly in terms of how to blocking information come from the authorities themselves. There is this description of the press as sort of someone that needs to be pushed back because they're not telling us the truth, and the truth is barely controlled by the government themselves. So this is a very dangerous narrative.
And then many of the investigations, they start, but then they're stopped. Again, that seems to be something that's being done by officials at both state level and at local level.
One of the biggest problems in Mexico undoubtedly is impunity. For instance, if we analyze the special prosecutor for crimes against freedom of expression, we've noticed that they have done 21 different sentences out of more than 1,600 investigations. So we're talking about an impunity that is above 98% of cases. 98% of cases simply do not reach, and this is specifically in the special prosecutor of crimes against freedom of expression. So we're talking mostly about journalists.
I mean, the issue of impunity, is there anything that can be done to make sure that there are more prosecutions and more successful prosecutions? Is there something to be done, or is it part of the wider issue of the attitude of officialdom towards journalism?
The attitude is for certainly one point. However, there are structural issues that need to be taken care of. For instance, the judiciary needs to have a proper independence in many situations from local and state powers. And as well, we also need to focus more on the type of research capacity that the prosecutor's office is having. In many ways, there is no attempt to aid to these investigations, and we're talking about very substantive issues. On the other hand, we also need more of a prevention strategy in terms of training and capacity building on our public officials and even our police officers. They need to understand what freedom of expression is and what human rights are, specifically in terms of journalists. We also need to pressure and build upon the idea that journalists are actually part of an very important part of democracy. Without journalists, we don't understand how the world around us works. We need access to information. The right to access to information is something that we can work in a strong campaign within civil society. How to understand what's going on. We depend on journalists in many ways. And that is part of my own human rights, to have journalists around digesting all the information and also giving the different points of view.
Clearly, the main issues are going to be solved within the country, within Mexico. But is there any way that the international community can help in this process?
Absolutely. The international community needs to keep pressuring the Mexican government to fulfill its obligations, not only within its own constitution, but also within international human rights standards. There have been multiple attempts by international organizations and by the United Nations itself to evaluate how these responses are being taken care of. For instance, the High Commissioner for Human Rights a couple of years ago created a list of 104 recommendations for the protection mechanism for journalists. The recommendations are there. We know what's the way, but the international community can help us a long way in reminding the government that it has responsibilities to its own citizens.
Pedro, thank you very, very much for helping us to look at this issue.
Thank you very much to David and Pedro for that piece. We established the Courage in Journalism Award at the Legatum Institute to honour Daphne Caruana Galizia and to shine a light on the very real dangers facing journalists around the world, in countries like Mexico. We are honoured to have Daphne's son Paul with us today to update us on the significant changes in Malta as a direct result of his mother's death and the real impact of her legacy. Paul, thanks so much for being with us today. Since we started this award 3 years ago, I know that you and your family have been fighting hard to bring about justice for your mother. And in recent months, it seems that things are really starting to change. Can you give us an update on the developments in your mother's case as a result of the work that you've been doing?
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me and continuing this award. So the funny thing is, had you asked me that question 2 months ago, the answer would have been really different, because in the past 2 months, we had one of the hitmen change his plea to guilty to the first conviction. And we had a series of arrests and criminal charges against people who weren't involved in my mother's murder, but were the subjects of her reporting. So very high-level political figures with a lot of corruption, fraud, were charged over the weekend, 5 years after she reported on them. So the investigation, though, it worked in fits and starts. The 3 hitmen were arrested a month after the murder. And for the year that followed, so the year in which she launched this award, it was really terrible, frankly, because we had no idea what was happening. There was no apparent progress in the murder investigation. And really, as a function of that, my 2 brothers and I kind of traveled around Europe and the world, lobbying politicians, officials, other journalists to take up my mother's case. And then another year after that, we started seeing some progress. So really strong international pressure on Malta to reform in a way that would allow the kind of good and honest police officers, members of the judiciary, to do their work as they're meant to. And then we had more arrests in November 2019, and ever since then, it's just been non-stop. It's really been moving at breakneck speed. We have now criminal proceedings against 3 hitmen, a middleman who was pardoned to 10 states witness, and the man who commissioned them. And as of about 2 months ago now, 2 men who supplied the bomb that was used against my mother. So proceedings against 7 men. 7 men have been charged. One accepted 15 years in exchange for testifying against the rest of them, and the middleman was pardoned completely for the murder in exchange for testimony. So that's where we are. We're some way from a jury trial. So these are all pre-trial proceedings.
Sure. I mean, it's just amazing, and inspiring actually to hear that despite, the hard work, you're seeing real progress. And down to you and your family for raising this awareness. I mean, I've no doubt that seeking this justice is hard fought and relentless on you and your family. What else needs to be done? And what else do you want to see happening in Malta? What's the next step?
So I think I found the last discussion about Mexico really interesting, because as with Malta, the problem wasn't exclusively organized crime. Of course, organized crime flourishes when the state allows it to. In Malta's case, it wasn't, the problem wasn't the proximity of organized crime to the governing class. The problem was that the governing class was inseparable. It was part of this organized crime group. And so for a murder investigation, that causes enormous problems, because you aren't talking about targeting a specific individual who is a criminal, or a specific group, which is a crime group. You're talking about dismantling an entire infrastructure that allowed organized crime to develop and really capture the Maltese state in our case. I mean, it was complete capture of key institutions. our anti-money laundering authority, key parts of the judiciary, key parts of the police force. So from the start, we were in this strange situation. We had our suspicions as to who, as individuals, were behind the murder, but from the start, it was obvious to us that ultimate responsibility was with the Maltese state. And we finally, years and years later, and by the way, this is something my mother always campaigned for, we are starting to see the kind of reform that Malta always needed. In short, the kind of reform that would have made all this impossible. The kind of reform where Malta would have stopped being a place where you car bomb people in broad daylight, where you're a conduit for trafficked drugs and people to the rest of the world. So what we need to see more of is more robust reform. We need to see it moving much faster, and we need to see serious accountability, not just in a criminal justice sense, but in a societal sense. We need to reflect and ask ourselves, how did this happen? How did Malta become a place where something like this can happen? And what are the lessons we can learn for it to never happen again?
Your testimony and experience shows us that whilst change is difficult, real change is possible. And you speak of that being on that journey, I guess. After all that you've been through, what's your reflection and ask of us all and the international community as we seek to champion press freedoms globally?
I think the short answer is that the international response needs to be immediate and robust. And the first thing my brothers and I did is go, for example, to the European Parliament. The lucky, unlucky thing about Malta is that as a small country, in fact, the EU's smallest member state, is that it's very vulnerable to international pressure in a way that, say, Turkey or Russia aren't. So if Brussels starts bearing down on Malta, or Strasbourg, the European Council of Europe rather, starts bearing down on Malta, that has a real effect. So one example in Malta's case is the public inquiry into my mother's assassination, the first public inquiry in Malta's history, which came out of my family's campaigning, which then turned into a motion that the Council of Europe voted on. So it said to Malta, you either convene a public inquiry or will implement some form of sanctions against you. Without that, no public inquiry, no broader accountability. So the summary answer again is a more vigilant international response, a kind of a way of monitoring what's happening before the murder, right? Because the murder is obviously too late. My mother was sued about 70 times before she was killed. By that point, the Council of Europe had started taking an interest in her case. But that was way too late. It was too late. It was so far gone already. And, there must be other cases out there like hers where journalists are being harassed and intimidated. And you let that run, it ends in a obvious place. And I wish we had some mechanism that allowed us to monitor that kind of harassment of journalists before it is too late.
Well, and that is why we are here today, to raise awareness and to bring the international community together, to stand with you and to work on behalf of journalists all around the world who are in difficult, hostile environments. So thank you, Paul. We're so grateful for having you here with us today. We continue to support you and your family, as you know, as you seek justice and reform in Malta, and we stand with you as friends in that. So thanks so much for being with us.
No, thank you so much.
Both Daphne's and Maria Elena's stories are stark reminders of the urgent need for renewed international focus to ensure journalists' safety and a free press globally. Daphne's story also serves as an inspiration, as Paul's talked about, to what can be achieved in the fight for justice and change. But we're just on the start of that journey. Attending this event this afternoon, we have politicians, businessmen and women, journalists and campaigners. And as we have heard, all of us can contribute to make a difference. I want to thank all of the amazing contributors to the Legatum Institute Courage and Journalism Award. And finally, to remember and honour all of those journalists around the world who find themselves working in hostile environments at risk to their own personal safety. We at the Legatum Institute stand in solidarity with you as we all seek to champion better media freedom, access to information, and truth across every nation of the world. Thank you so much for joining us today.